Welcome to Mix and Match, the show where we match different pieces of gear together and mix it all into one live performance. We talk about the pros and the cons of the setup, and a little bit about the inspiration behind the whole thing. To kick it off, let's take a look at the gear we'll be using today. First up is the Polyend Play. We'll use this for MIDI sequencing. Second, I've got this knob controller by Schick, which obviously will be dialing in different effects and parameters on this one. The audio setup is an Arturia Mini Fuse 2, into which I am running a Sennheiser E835 microphone, and I'll be using my wireless III headphones. For controlling live and playing in different synths, we've got the Novation Launchkey Mini Mark IV. And all of this is running into a MacBook Air running Ableton Live. More about that DAW setup in a bit. And this whole setup is built in an Analog Cases Unison case, and I want to say thank you to Analog Cases for sponsoring this video. I like using a performance case because it's like a sort of creative limitation for me. I can build the whole setup in one easy to pack up and travel with case, and the purpose of this setup is to be for live performances. So if I want to take this on the go, the Unison performance case is nice and strong and sturdy. It's going to protect my gear. You'll also notice that I've got the Polyend Play on a stand. This stand is expandable. This is an XTS stand from Analog Cases, and ergonomically it's actually perfect for this setup where I've got the screen and the sequencer tilted up toward my head instead of me having to crane my neck over it. I've got a couple of these stands. They've got a small version and a large version, and trays that you can use so you can put multiple pieces of gear on a single stand. So if you're looking for a performance case, some stands, or even some travel cases for your gear, check out Analog Cases. Link is in the description. Let me bring you through some of the inspiration for some of the music and the type of performance we'll be putting together today. I love ambient music, and one artist I've been listening to a lot of is Hiroshi Yoshimura, a Japanese ambient musician who was active during the 80's and 90's. He's no longer with us today, but his albums have kind of exploded in popularity on YouTube. Like the YouTube algorithm found its way to this guy's music, and suddenly way into the future we're still enjoying his ambient music. But this combination of atmospherics and field recordings and rhythmic stuff really has inspired me lately. And what's interesting about his work is that a lot of it was composed to be played in a space. It wasn't necessarily composed to be listened to in isolation on headphones. In fact, in his 1986 release Surround, the liner notes read, "If surround can be listened to as music that's as close to air itself, allowing us to enter each listener's sound scenery, or as something that exists within a new perspective, expanding the middle ground between sound and music and transforming it into a comfortable space, it would be much appreciated. Its volume should not be a hindrance to a conversation and should be placed in the same family of sounds as the vibration of footsteps, the hum of an air conditioner, or the clanging of a spoon inside of a coffee cup." So he's really thinking about his music in the context of a space and in the context of our daily lives. What's interesting about this is Surround was originally commissioned by Misawa Homes, and the music was seen as sort of an additional amenity to show off in their model homes. And for me and my musical approach, sometimes I get caught up in thinking, oh, I need to, change something every 4 bars, and there needs to be some drama happening across a track. But a track can also be laid back and relaxed. It can also just be part of the air around us. So I will be thinking about that in crafting the music for this setup and trying to not be so impatient with my musical composition. Jumping forward to today, I was also inspired by South Korean duo Salamanda. They often have hybrid hardware and software pieces that trend towards the ambient, kind of similar to the music we were talking about earlier, and then they also bring in some more modern, maybe some more experimental sound design elements as well. Like Hiroshi Yoshimura, their music can be drifty and atmospheric, but also includes a lot of rhythmic stuff. They don't shy away from using drums and percussion, and they also use a lot of mallet instruments to drive their music. They also include live vocals and looped vocals, which I just think adding vocals into an electronic music track completely elevates the music and brings it from being something that's electronic and digital into something that feels just much more human. It's our challenge as electronic musicians to bring the humanity into it, so I think that's a really easy and obvious way to do it, and I really like the execution of it in their music. Overall, their hybrid approach with using lots of hardware controllers and synths, as well as using a DAW like Ableton Live, is something I've fallen into for this setup. So that's my current inspiration for this setup. Definitely recommend you check out the links in the description and check out these artists. But now let me actually get into the nitty-gritty of how this setup is going to work. Okay, starting with the DAW. I've got 4 instruments in Ableton Live that are specifically meant to be sequenced by the Polyend play. I've got an electric piano sound, which I'll use to play live on the Launchkey, a vocal track so I can do some vocal looping, and also a field recording track, which will be just a baseline atmosphere for the whole thing. There's also lots of effects happening in the DAW, which I'm going to control with the Schick controller. And for these 32 knobs, I started to develop a system. Each column on the controller will represent a track. So column 1 represents the first synth in the project. And for those different tracks, I'll have volume for each of the tracks on the bottom row of the controller. And I'll also have a filter on the top row, leaving the 2 center knobs to be kind of like flex knobs for different effects. On the last column of the controller, I'm going to control some master effects like some granular effects and some reverb. The Launchkey is a convenient controller for this setup as well, because of course if I want to play in keys, I've got the keyboard there, but I can also navigate around Ableton Live, so I can launch different clips and navigate around session view. Easily just press the record button to trigger different loops, and I've got some custom mapping so that I can arm the voice or the keyboard instrument whenever I need to. Like I said earlier, Polyend Play is going to be sequencing 4 synth tracks in Ableton Live. The Polyend Play is a really interesting device because writing music on a sequencer like this with their sort of like pick and place system, meaning like every light you see on the grid of the Polyend Play can have different parameters. It can be sent on a different MIDI channel, it can have a different velocity, it can have a different note length. I kind of like working on this grid and going in and tweaking every individual note, and then also working with probability, because even though we'll just have this short loop continuously running, playing with chance will actually make the sequences different every time that loop runs. So I found it to be really fun and almost like meditative to create different atmospheric ambient sequences built on the Polyend Play. Making music on the Polyend Play does force me to slow down and think about writing music differently than if I was just playing on the keys. You start to develop habits when you play an instrument. Everything can start to sound the same if you're not super disciplined about it, but a completely different approach, like I spoke about earlier with picking and placing notes and tweaking each individual note on the Polyend Play, is a real strength of this kind of setup, and I've been really enjoying it. But I will say I'm very happy with how this turned out. Once I started developing the systems for how I would use each controller, things got a lot easier, and I feel like now that I've created kind of 2 tracks within this performance, I feel like I can expand this and almost future-proof this setup so that I can continue to use it instead of constantly changing my setup, which I've kind of embraced the fact that there's nothing wrong with that, and that's why I started this series, Mix and Match. And that's where you all come in. I want to mix and match more gear together, so if you can give me different combinations down in the comments that you think I should try, let's kind of cap it at 3 or 4 pieces of gear. I would love to hear your suggestions in the comments, and I would love to start taking some suggestions from the audience for the next episode of Mix and Match. Thank you so much to Analog Cases for sponsoring this series. Shout out to my channel members for supporting the channel, and thank you all so much for watching. This has been TAETRO. Have a good one.